Over time, the Israelites who had been spread throughout Babylon and other countries began to arrive back home and worship God in Jerusalem at the newly rebuilt temple. But the wall around Jerusalem had still not been rebuilt, leaving it vulnerable to an attack. There was an Israelite named Nehemiah who was living in Susa at the time. When he was told that the Israelites were returning to Jerusalem, but there was no wall to protect them, he wept and prayed, asking God to help rebuild the wall. Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem and gathered the priests and officials and told them of his plan. The plan worked, and the wall was rebuilt in only 52 days. Nehemiah wanted to make sure the Israelites were not only safe, but worshipped God with their whole lives. So after the wall was completed, he gathered all of the Israelites, and the priest Ezra read to them from the book of Moses. The people understood that they were not currently living God's ways, so they began to weep. But Ezra stopped them, instructing them to instead celebrate all that God had done and return to God's ways. So the Israelites did what Ezra said and began to party. This went on for several days. A short time after this, God sent another prophet named Malachi to the Israelites. Malachi warned the people of what would happen if they turned from God's ways, but also reminded the people of God's promise to bless Israel and use them to bless the entire world. After Malachi, God did not speak to the Israelites through a prophet for 400 years, but God would not be silent forever.
There's only one structure built by human hands on earth that is visible from the far reaches of the earth. You know what it is? The Great Wall of China. It took 1,800 years to build it. They started construction in 220 BC, and they finished sometime during the Ming Dynasty of the 1600s. When it was completed, it was 6,000 miles long. And at one point, 800,000 people were working on that wall day and night. Some people spent their entire lives building this wall. The Great Wall of China is one of the most extraordinary building achievements of all time. But today I want to talk about another extraordinary building accomplishment of all time, and that is the walls around Jerusalem that have been destroyed. But today is a big day. Today is a big day because we're finishing up in the Old Testament, chapter 21. And can anybody say, hooray? Of course. It is good news that we have come all the way through the Old Testament, and good news is ahead of us when Jesus arrives next week. And I haven't been more excited to be telling the Christmas story again in new light and new ideas and new visions for what God has in store for us. Never have I ever paid attention to the Christmas story in the middle of Lent or even St. Patrick's Day. It's going to be quite special to tell that Christmas story of the birth of a promise on March the 16th. That's going to be amazing for me, and I hope it is for you also. It's been quite a journey through the time that we've spent over the last 21 weeks. We've hung in there. We've persevered. We've continued to study the story each week of the story of God. Today we look at chapter 21 of the story, and one of the main characters in this chapter is Ezra. Now, Ezra is a priest who helped to gather the people of God together, and he told them that he wanted to listen carefully for what he says. But let me give you a little bit of a setting here for what's happening in the story. Thousands of people have returned from their exile in Babylon, and they've come back to Jerusalem. Some 50,000 Israelites have come home under the leadership of an Israelite named Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel called them then to rebuild the temple. And then we had the story about the Israelites being saved in Persia through Queen Esther last week. And then two more groups of people returned to Jerusalem, and one of the groups was led by Ezra. the priest. And the final group that comes back to Jerusalem is led by the cupbearer of King Artaxerxes, called Nehemiah. And Nehemiah's assignment was to build the walls again so that the temple that was rebuilt, the Solomon's temple that was rebuilt again after the exile, could then remain safe. So the people of Israel could continue to worship God wholeheartedly without fear of danger for people to come and cause them strife. The title of this chapter is Rebuilding the Walls. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the bricks and mortar part of the rebuilding, but I do want to talk about what it involves with in our daily living and how we rebuild our own faith. To back up a bit, we think back over the rebuilding of our faith life through the Old Testament. We've journeyed from the beginning of creation, the book of Genesis, and we've studied God's Word through the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden, and we've gone through the time of Moses and the Exodus, and the time of the kings, of the evil and the good kings, and then in the time of the prophets. We've seen the whole story unfold before our eyes. And I don't know about you, but I think as we've gone through this story, I now have a much clearer picture of how the Bible is put together. Because so many of us, we go through the Bible and we pick up a chapter or a quote here or even a book, and we think, well, this one follows this one and this one follows this one. But it actually is set up more like a library rather than a chronology. So as we've studied the story, we've got a more complete picture of how the story of God has unfolded and how God has continually tried to restore God's people, tried to bring them back to God and rebuild their faith lives in their journey. King Solomon had it right for a time when he ordered his subjects to build a beautiful and ornate temple. That was a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, that Solomon built this temple. And then 2 weeks ago, they rebuilt it again. So that's sort of the first building project that we encounter in this chapter. We're reminded of that great temple that Solomon had built originally, because the temple represented the place where God was at work and where the people were able to worship God fully with all their hearts, their souls, and their mind. And that temple was in the center of town. It wasn't up on a hillside or on an island or down the road. It was right in the center of town. So each time they came to downtown Jerusalem, they were reminded of God's presence. So when they rebuilt the temple 2 weeks ago, they were reminding themselves that God is ever present in their lives. Now today, we hear the great story of the rebuilding of the walls. So through the time of the prophet the cupbearer Nehemiah and the prophet Malachi, and of the priest Ezra, they came back to Jerusalem and they realized that, wow, the walls are really destroyed. We need to do something. And they wept. They were really sad about that for themselves and also for the people around Jerusalem. They were sad that the walls had been destroyed because they'd been built. And now their call by God is to rebuild those walls up again so that they could be in a safe place. But they were overwhelmed by it all, and they weren't really sure how to do that, but they called upon God to grant them wisdom and energy to build the walls. So what they did was they encountered all the people. They pulled in all the people of Israel, and they rebuilt the walls together using teamwork, like I did with the children's time, building all the building blocks and having everybody in the community build together. If you've ever built a project, you know that many hands make light work, don't they? It really helps. And we have a big project to get as many people involved, and there's ownership of that project, and they get their hands dirty and get busy. And that's what Nehemiah did, as he called upon God's people of Israel to rebuild the walls and to work together and do it in a very passionate, life-giving way. So that's the second rebuilding that we've seen in the story of God in this chapter. The third one is the rebuilding of their faith. And that's the most vital piece of it all, is that it's not about the bricks and mortar, but it's about the faith journey. It's about what's going on inside our hearts, our souls, and our minds. That when we come to begin the season of Lent, today's the beginning of Lent. Did you know that? It's 6 weeks ahead of us is Easter. And when we enter the journey of Lent, we reflect upon that journey that Jesus had in the wilderness. And in the time that he was reflecting on his faith and his life and the people of Jerusalem, and he went ahead knowing that something was ahead of him that weren't really too sure. But during the season of Lent is a time of reflection. On Wednesday evening, we had an Ash Wednesday service, and we reflected on the meaning of Lent somewhat in that, and we put ashes on our forehead to represent the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross for all of us. And we had an opportunity for people to bring up items of or symbols of sacrifice that people brought forward. Some brought stones, representing the hard things in their lives. Some people brought branches to represent the trees that they're sad about, that were destroyed in the ice storm. And others brought other meaningful articles to be brought forward to represent the giving up during Lent, or the taking on of something new. For some people during the season of Lent is they take on a new project. They take on something spiritual. Some of you might have read the News from the Pews a couple Thursdays ago, and I invited people to take part in the 40 Acts of Lent. It's an online resource through the UK, and if you've signed up, you realize that every day in your inbox, in your email, you get a new act. So there's been 4 acts already in this season, and you get to reflect on those, like journaling and being a tool of resource for other people and things like that. And they will continue to build for the next 40 days. So those are ways that we can rebuild our faith, like the people of Jerusalem in Nehemiah and Ezra and Malachi. They call upon God to give them strength and hope and endurance and kindness and love and self-control in order to build their lives with one another. When we come to church, we come to be uplifted. We come to build our lives spiritually. We come to reflect in the Scriptures and to pray and to be in a community with one another that strengthens and supports each other. So that's what the story of the Old Testament is about, is rebuilding our lives of faith. And now we're at the end of the Old Testament, and we go forward with the good news that the Messiah will come. And the Messiah is Jesus Christ, who will come as good news, who will be a new kind of king that the people have yearned for generations. And that is good news, that we're at the end of the Old Testament, and we're going to begin with the New Testament with a fresh new eyes, fresh new vision of what God's plan has in store for us. And we go boldly forward with the freshness and the newness of a spiritual soul that will be refreshed in the living waters of faith. Thanks be to God. Amen.